Case 1. Carolyn Warmus, the fatal attraction. There are moments when an ordinary community is forced to question everything it believes about the people around it. Moments when trust, routine, and familiarity are quietly replaced by doubt. In places where life moves at a steady, predictable pace, it's easy to believe that nothing truly unexpected could ever happen there. In Greenbug, New York, during the winter of 1989, life followed that exact rhythm. Mornings began with parents preparing their children for school. Neighbors exchanged brief waves across driveways. Classrooms filled with the sound of lessons, conversations, and the steady routine of everyday life. It was the kind of environment built on structure, on trust, and on the belief that those within it shared the same sense of responsibility and care. But beneath that sense of normalcy, something was quietly unfolding. Something that would soon challenge everything the community thought it understood about one of its own. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most are living lives we never truly see. Carolyn Warmus, January 1989. At the time, she was known as a dedicated teacher, someone who worked closely with students and was seen as part of the community's foundation. But as events began to unfold, investigators would start to piece together a story that went far beyond the image people thought they knew. One that would draw national attention and leave lasting questions about trust, relationships, and the hidden sides of human behavior. Her name was Carolyn Warmus. She was 25 years old. She was blonde, ambitious, and by nearly every outward measure, the picture of a successful young professional. She had grown up wealthy. Her father, Thomas Warmus, was a wealthy insurance executive in Michigan, and Carolyn had lived a life of relative privilege. She attended the University of Michigan, where she earned her undergraduate degree and later completed graduate studies at Columbia University's Teachers College in New York City, one of the most respected education programs in the entire country. By all appearances, she had everything going for her. A prestigious education, a career she had trained hard for, a life that was just beginning to open up in front of her. She was working as a teacher at Greenville Elementary School in Greenburgh, and her colleagues described her as intelligent, focused, and driven. She was the kind of person who made an impression, the kind of person you remembered after meeting just once. But beneath the polished surface, something else was building. Something that those who knew her best were beginning to sense, though few could fully name it yet. Carolyn Warmus had become deeply, obsessively attached to a man who was not available to her. His name was Paul Solomon. He was also a teacher, working at the same school, and he was married. His wife, Betty Jean Solomon, was a 36-year-old woman living a quiet life in their home in Greenbug. Betty Jean was not a public figure. She was not someone the world would have known. She was a wife, and she was living her life in the way that millions of people do, without any awareness that someone she had never wronged was focused on her with an intensity that would ultimately cost Betty Jean everything. Investigators would later piece together what the months before January 15, 1989, had looked like. Carolyn and Paul Solomon had been involved in an affair. Whether Paul truly understood the depth of Carolyn's feelings for him, whether he recognized the signs that were there, is something that has been debated for decades. What is not debated is what happened on that January evening. On the night of January 15, 1989, Betty Jean Solomon was found by her husband in their Greenbug condominium. She had been shot 9 times. She did not survive. The woman who had done nothing more than be in the way of someone else's obsession was gone, and a young daughter was left without her mother, and a community that had trusted its teachers was left shaken to its foundation. The investigation that followed was meticulous, detailed, and ultimately pointed in one direction. Detectives with the Greenbug Police Department began examining the people closest to Paul Solomon almost immediately. The discovery of the affair between Solomon and Carolyn Warmus placed her squarely in the center of the investigation. Witnesses came forward who had seen Carolyn near the Solomon home that evening. Phone records were examined. Physical evidence was collected and analyzed. And at the center of everything was a singular, damning piece of evidence: a pair of gloves, later tied to the purchase of a silencer. Investigators traced the purchase of a 9mm silencer to a private investigator named Vincent Parco. It was determined that Carolyn Warmus had obtained the silencer shortly before the night Betty Jean lost her life. Parco himself was drawn into the investigation, and the web of connections surrounding Warmus began to tighten, with each passing week of the investigation. What followed was one of the most heavily covered criminal cases of the early 1990s. The trial of Carolyn Warmus captured the attention of the entire country, in part because of what it represented. A beautiful, educated, privileged young woman accused of orchestrating a cold and calculated act of violence against an innocent woman, all in the pursuit of a man who was never truly hers to have. Journalists called it the Fatal Attraction case, a reference to the 1987 psychological thriller in which a woman's obsession with a married man spirals into terrifying violence. The parallel was uncomfortable in its accuracy. The first trial, held in 1991, ended in a hung jury. The jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, and for a brief period, it appeared that the case might not reach the resolution that investigators and the Solomon family had fought so hard to achieve. But prosecutors were not finished. A second trial was convened, and this time the result was different. In May of 1992, Carolyn Warmus was convicted of second-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with tension as the verdict was read. Paul Solomon sat among the observers. The family of Betty Jean Solomon, who had waited 3 years for this moment, heard the word that they had needed to hear. Guilty. Carolyn Warmus was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. She was taken into custody and began serving her sentence at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, the same maximum security women's prison where Pamela Smart, another name you will hear later in this very documentary, would also spend her years. Warmus maintained her innocence throughout her incarceration. She gave interviews from behind bars in which she spoke of what she described as a wrongful conviction. She appealed her sentence multiple times. Each appeal was denied. The courts reviewed the evidence and the trial record and upheld the conviction consistently over the years that followed. In June of 2019, after serving 27 years, Carolyn Warmus was granted parole. She was released from Bedford Hills at the age of 55. The release was quiet compared to the spectacle of her trial. There were no cameras capturing the moment the way there had been cameras capturing the verdict. The world had moved on, though the Solomon family never truly could. The legacy of this case is not simply a story about jealousy or obsession, though those elements are undeniably present. It is a story about the devastating consequences that unfold when a person in a position of trust and responsibility allows the darker corners of their interior life to go unchecked. Carolyn Warmus stood in front of children every day. She was entrusted with their education, their growth, their safety. And yet she harbored within her a fixation so consuming that it ended in tragedy. Betty Jean Solomon deserved to live her life. She deserved to see her daughter grow up. She deserved the ordinary mornings and quiet evenings that every person deserves. She did not receive them. And it is her memory, not the spectacle of the trial, not the tabloid headlines, not the Hollywood comparisons, that should anchor every retelling of this story. Law enforcement officials who worked this case spent years gathering the evidence needed to bring this matter to justice. The Greenburgh Police Department, the Westchester County District Attorney's Office, and the investigators who meticulously traced every phone record, every financial transaction, and every witness account deserve recognition for their commitment to seeking accountability on behalf of a woman who could no longer speak for herself. This case also stands as a reminder of how critically important it is that our communities remain attentive to the warning signs that something may be wrong, whether in a school, a neighborhood, a workplace, or a home. Obsessive behavior, patterns of possessiveness, and the erosion of boundaries between professional and personal life are not simply personality quirks. They are warning signs that deserve to be taken seriously, reported to the appropriate authorities, and never dismissed as harmless. Betty Jean Solomon's daughter grew up without her mother because someone refused to accept the word no. That is a truth that never loses its weight, no matter how many years pass. If you are someone who works with vulnerable individuals, or if you know someone whose behavior has raised your concern, the resources available through the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not have to navigate these concerns alone. Help is always available. Justice, in the case of Betty Jean Solomon, came slowly. But it came. And for families walking through the aftermath of similar tragedies today, the pursuit of that justice remains as important and as necessary as it has ever been. If this story moved you, if it made you think, If it reminded you why cases like this one deserve to be remembered and not forgotten, then please take a moment right now to show your support for Cold Case Time. Hit the like button, leave a comment below telling us what you think about this case, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Every like, every comment, every subscription helps this channel continue to bring you the cases that matter. Thank you for watching, and thank you for caring about the truth. Case 2. Linda Carty, the baby stolen by darkness. There are crimes that challenge the very limits of human comprehension. Crimes so calculated, so ruthless, and so devoid of any recognizable humanity that investigators and judges and juries are left searching for a framework that can adequately contain what they are looking at. The case of Linda Carty is one of those crimes. To understand what happened in Houston, Texas, in the spring of 2001, you first need to understand who Linda Carty was, or rather, who she presented herself to be. Because Linda Carty was a woman of many faces, many identities, and many stories, and not all of them were true. Linda Carty was born in St. Kitts in the Caribbean in 1958. She immigrated to the United States and, by the time she arrived in Texas, had constructed a life that appeared, on the surface, to be built on respectability. She had worked as a schoolteacher. She was a mother. She moved through her Houston community with confidence and a certain kind of authority, presenting herself as educated, capable, and trustworthy. She was the kind of person you would be inclined to believe, the kind of person whose word carried weight simply because of how she carried herself. But Linda Carty's real life, the one that investigators would slowly and painstakingly unravel in the months and years that followed the spring of 2001, bore very little resemblance to the image she had so carefully constructed. Joanna Rodriguez was 20 years old in the spring of 2001. She was a young mother living in a modest apartment in the Beltway 8 area of Houston. She had recently given birth to her son, a baby boy named Ray Lee. The birth had been recent, and Joanna was in that exhausted, tender, overwhelming season of early motherhood. She was young, and she was doing her best, and she was surrounded by people who loved her. Her partner, Jose Medellin, was present in their lives. There was a future ahead of them, small and uncertain as all young futures are, but real and full of possibility. On May 16, 2001, that future was taken from Joanna Rodriguez in one of the most calculated and brutal ways imaginable. Linda Carty, according to the evidence presented at trial, had a problem. She had told people, including her own partner, that she was pregnant. She had allowed the story to develop and grow over the course of months, and the day of reckoning for that lie was approaching. She needed a baby, and she had decided, with a coldness that investigators would later describe as chilling, exactly where she was going to get one. On that day in May, Linda Carty recruited a group of men to assist her. She directed them to Joanna Rodriguez's apartment. The men broke in. Joanna was in her home with her newborn son, Ray Lee. What followed was an act of coordinated and premeditated violence. Joanna Rodriguez was overpowered, placed in the trunk of a vehicle, and transported while helpless and unable to call for help. Her newborn baby was taken from her arms. Joanna Rodriguez did not survive. She was found, and the manner of her passing, confined, helpless, alone, was one that left the investigators who worked this case with images they would carry for the rest of their careers. Ray Lee, the infant at the center of this case, was recovered safely. He survived. His survival is the single thread of light in an otherwise entirely dark case. He was found, he was returned to his family, and he grew up. But he grew up without his mother. He grew up in the absence of the woman who had held him and cared for him in the first days of his life, and nothing about the outcome of this case can change that. Linda Carty was arrested and charged with capital murder. The investigation that led to her arrest was thorough and far-reaching. Investigators traced the planning of the crime, the recruitment of the men who participated, and the direct role that Carty played in directing every step of the operation. The prosecution built a case that was, in the words of those who observed the trial, meticulously detailed and deeply damning. The trial took place in 2002. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of capital murder. They then heard the penalty phase arguments and, after consideration, recommended the sentence of death. The judge accepted the recommendation. Linda Carty was sentenced to death and transferred to the Gatesville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, where she has remained on death row ever since. What followed the conviction has been a lengthy and internationally significant legal battle. Linda Carty's case attracted attention from human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, and drew scrutiny from abroad, particularly from the United Kingdom and from the Caribbean community. Carty's defense team argued over the years that she had received inadequate legal representation at trial, that exculpatory evidence had been withheld, and that her background and mitigating circumstances had not been properly presented to the jury. Appeals were filed, reviewed, and denied at multiple levels of the American judicial system. The British government, noting Carty's connections to the UK, raised concerns about her case through diplomatic channels. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights examined elements of her legal situation. None of these interventions resulted in the overturning of her conviction or the commutation of her sentence. As of the time of this documentary, Linda Carty remains on death row in Texas. Her case continues to be cited by legal scholars and human rights advocates as an example of the complexities surrounding capital punishment, the right to adequate representation, and the international dimensions of American criminal justice. But in the center of all of that legal complexity, at the very heart of the case, is a young woman named Joanna Rodriguez. She was 20 years old. She was a new mother. She had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. She had been targeted not because of anything she had done, but because someone else wanted what she had, the child she had carried, the baby she had brought into the world. Joanna's family has had to carry the weight of her absence for more than 2 decades now. Her son, Ray Lee, has had to grow up constructing an identity without the mother who bore him. These are costs that no legal proceeding, no appeal, no international inquiry, and no sentence can fully address. They are the human costs, and they endure long after the courtrooms have gone quiet. The case of Linda Carty is also a sobering reminder that the people who present themselves most confidently as trustworthy and respectable are not always what they appear. A background in education, a professional demeanor, a place in the community, none of these things are guarantees of character. They are surfaces, and what lies beneath the surface is sometimes something entirely different from what the surface suggests. For anyone who has questions about the safety of a child in their community, or who suspects that a child may be in danger, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available at 1-800-422-4453, 24 hours a day. You are never powerless. You can always make the call. Joanna Rodriguez deserved to raise her son. She deserved the ordinary miracle of watching Ray Lee grow up. That was taken from her, and the pursuit of justice in her name has been one of the most complex and consequential chapters in the history of Texas criminal law. If this case resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Your support is what allows this channel to keep telling the stories that need to be told. Every click matters. Thank you. Case 3. Mary Kay Letourneau, the classroom betrayal. There are cases in the history of American crime that do not fit the mold that most people imagine when they hear the words true crime documentary. They do not involve strangers. They do not begin in the darkness of a back alley or in the isolation of a rural road. They begin somewhere far more familiar. Somewhere that every family in America trusts without question. Somewhere that children are sent every single morning with the assumption that they will be safe. They begin in the classroom. The case of Mary Kay Letourneau is one that, for a very specific and troubling set of reasons, managed to confuse the American public in a way that few cases before or since have managed to do. It generated headlines that straddled the line between crime reporting and tabloid fascination. It produced debates in living rooms and newsrooms across the country about how to categorize what had happened and why it had happened and what it meant. And in the decades that followed, the conversation around this case has matured significantly, shaped by a broader and much-needed societal reckoning with the nature of predatory behavior and the way it is sometimes disguised, minimized, or misrepresented. Let us be completely clear from the beginning. What Mary Kay Letourneau did was a crime. What she did caused harm. And the young person at the center of this case was a child who deserved the protection of every adult in his life, including and especially the teacher who was supposed to be educating him. Mary Kay Letourneau was born in December of 1962 in South Dakota. She grew up in a politically prominent household. Her father, John Schmitz, was a United States congressman from California and a figure of some national recognition. She attended college, married, and eventually settled in the Seattle, Washington area, where she built a career as an elementary and middle school teacher. She was described by many of those who knew her as warm, engaging, and devoted to her students. She was a mother of 4 children. She appeared, from the outside, to be a woman who had built exactly the kind of life that society expects and rewards. She was teaching at Shorewood Elementary School in Burien, Washington, when she first encountered a boy named Villy Foileau. He was in her 2nd grade class when they met. He was, at that point, approximately 8 years old. By the time the relationship that would ultimately destroy her career and send her to prison had developed, he was 12. Villy Foileau was a child of Samoan descent from a working-class background. He was creative, artistically gifted, and by the accounts of those who knew him, a boy who was searching for something that was missing in the structure of his home life. Mary Kay Letourneau identified that searching quality in him, encouraged his artistic gifts, maintained a relationship with him that crossed professional boundaries, and ultimately allowed that relationship to develop in ways that no adult in a position of trust and authority over a child should ever allow. In June of 1996, the relationship between Letourneau and Foileau became criminal in nature. He was 12 years old. She was 34. She was his teacher. The power imbalance between them was enormous and undeniable, regardless of how either party would later characterize what occurred. Letourneau became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter, Audrey, in May of 1997. By that point, the relationship had been discovered. Letourneau had been arrested in February of 1997 following a tip to investigators. She was charged with 2 counts of felony child rape in the state of Washington. In August of 1997, Letourneau entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of rape of a child in the 2nd degree. She was sentenced to 7.5 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended with the exception of 90 days, with the condition that she participate in a sexual deviancy treatment program and have absolutely no further contact with Villy Foileau. She did not honor that condition. Within weeks of her release in January of 1998, she was found in a car with Foileau by police officers who were conducting a routine patrol. She was pregnant again. The judge revoked the suspended sentence. Letourneau was sent back to prison to serve the full 7.5 years. She gave birth to a 2nd daughter, Georgia, while incarcerated. Both children were ultimately raised by Villy Foileau's mother, while Letourneau remained in prison. In 2004, after completing her sentence, Mary Kay Letourneau was released. A no-contact order that had been in place was eventually dissolved. In 2005, she and Villy Foileau, who was by then 21 years old, were legally married in a ceremony that attracted significant national media coverage. The marriage lasted until 2019, when the couple officially separated and divorced. Mary Kay Letourneau was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer in 2019. She passed away on July 6, 2020, at the age of 58. Her passing prompted another wave of public discourse about the case, about how it had been covered, and about the long-term effects of the harm that had been done to Villy Foileau. Foileau himself has spoken publicly, in the years following their separation, about the complexity of the experience and the ways in which the relationship affected his development, his sense of self, and his ability to build a healthy adult life. His perspective is one that deserves to be centered whenever this case is discussed. He was a child. He was placed in a situation that no child should be placed in. Whatever words were used by the media at the time, whatever romantic narrative was constructed around the case to make it more palatable for public consumption, the foundation of this story is the victimization of a young boy by an adult who held authority over him. Forensic psychologists and child protection advocates have noted that this case became a teachable moment in the broader conversation about how society processes and responds to crimes of this nature when the perpetrator is a woman. For decades, cases involving female perpetrators and male victims were treated with a kind of uncomfortable ambiguity, as if the gender of the perpetrator somehow diminished the severity of what had occurred. That framework has been challenged repeatedly and persuasively in the years since this case first came to public attention. Children cannot consent to relationships with adults, regardless of the gender of the adult involved. The law is clear on this. The psychology of child development is clear on this. And the responsibility of every teacher, every coach, every mentor, and every adult who works with young people to maintain absolute professional and personal boundaries is non-negotiable and cannot be rationalized away by any narrative, however emotionally compelling it might appear. The case of Kay Letourneau is taught in educational institutions, in law schools, and in teacher preparation programs across the United States as an example of what happens when those boundaries are violated. It is also, increasingly, being taught as an example of how media framing can distort public understanding of crime and victimization in ways that have real consequences for survivors. For parents who want to ensure that their children are safe in school environments, open and regular conversations about appropriate boundaries, about the difference between mentorship and manipulation, and about the importance of telling a trusted adult if any relationship with a teacher feels uncomfortable, are among the most powerful protective tools available. If this story made you think, if it changed the way you see a case you thought you already understood, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments section below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time for more documentary-style true crime content that goes beyond the headlines. Your support keeps this channel going. Thank you so much for being here. Case 4. Debra Lafave, When the System Failed a Child. The courthouse steps of Tampa, Florida, have witnessed many pivotal moments in the history of American justice. But in the autumn of 2005, those steps were the site of a moment that sparked a national conversation about inequality, about the way physical appearance influences legal outcomes, and about whether the American justice system truly delivers equal accountability regardless of who is standing before the bench. Debra Lafave was 24 years old when she was arrested in the summer of 2004. She had been working as a reading and English teacher at Angelo L. Greco Middle School in Temple Terrace, Florida, a suburb of Tampa. She was young, conventionally attractive, and by the accounts of those who had worked with her, she was engaging and personable in the classroom. She was also newly married. By every outward measure, she had a life that was functioning, even flourishing. Beneath that surface, however, investigators would discover a pattern of behavior that had placed a 14-year-old student directly in harm's way. The case came to the attention of law enforcement in June of 2004 after the mother of a teenage boy at the school contacted police. The mother had discovered text messages exchanged between her son and his teacher, messages that were inappropriate in nature and that suggested a relationship that had already progressed far beyond the professional. Investigators moved quickly. The boy was interviewed with care and sensitivity by trained professionals. What he described formed the basis of a criminal case against Debra Lafave. According to the evidence gathered by investigators, Lafave had engaged in repeated physical contact with the student. The encounters had taken place in multiple locations, in a classroom at the school, in a vehicle, and in a home. The student, who was 14 years old, had been drawn into these situations by an adult teacher who was in a position of absolute authority over him. Debra Lafave was charged with 4 counts of lewd and lascivious battery on a minor. The charges were serious. The potential sentence, if convicted on all counts, was significant. Prosecutors in Hillsborough County prepared for a trial, but the trial never happened. What unfolded instead was a legal and cultural controversy that continues to be referenced in discussions of gender and justice in the United States. Lafave's defense attorney, John Fitzgibbons, made a statement that drew immediate and widespread condemnation. He suggested, in a comment that was widely reported, that sending Debra Lafave to prison would be, in his words, too cruel, given her physical appearance. The implication that a conventionally attractive woman should be protected from the consequences of her crimes because those consequences would be harder for her to bear was an argument that legal scholars, child protection advocates, and survivors of similar experiences roundly and forcefully rejected. In November of 2005, Debra Lafave entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors in Hillsborough County. She pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 3 years of house arrest followed by 7 years of probation. She was not sentenced to prison. She was ordered to have no contact with minors, including children, and was required to register as a sex offender. The reaction to the plea deal was immediate and deeply divided. Victims' advocates argued that the sentence was grossly inadequate and sent a dangerous message about the relative value of justice for male victims of this type of crime. Legal commentators noted that similar cases involving male teachers and female students had routinely resulted in significant prison terms. The disparity was stark and uncomfortable, and it prompted a genuine national reckoning with the question of whether the justice system was applying its standards consistently. In Marion County, Florida, where a second set of charges relating to a separate instance had been filed, the prosecutor ultimately declined to proceed with the case, citing the wishes of the victim's family, who did not want their son to testify. The decision to drop those charges added another layer of controversy to an already deeply contested legal situation. Lafave's probation was not without incident. In 2008, she was accused of violating the terms of her probation after reportedly speaking with a minor child at a restaurant where she had taken a part-time job. Prosecutors ultimately chose not to revoke her probation in connection with this incident, though it reinforced the concerns of those who had argued from the beginning that the original sentence was insufficient. The young man at the center of this case, whose name has never been publicly identified in deference to his privacy as a victim, grew up carrying the impact of what had been done to him by an adult he had trusted. The research on the long-term psychological effects of this type of victimization on male adolescents is extensive and clear. The idea that boys are not harmed by these experiences, or that they are somehow fortunate rather than victimized, is a myth that has been thoroughly and repeatedly debunked by psychological research and by the first-person accounts of survivors who have come forward over the years. He deserved better. He deserved a justice system that treated his victimization with the same gravity and the same standards it would have applied if his situation had been reversed. He did not fully receive that, and the case of Debra Lafave stands as a cautionary example of what can happen when bias, whether gender bias, appearance bias, or both, is allowed to influence the administration of justice. What this case also underscores is the importance of parental vigilance and open communication. The fact that this case came to light at all was because a mother noticed something in her son's phone and had the presence of mind and the courage to take that information to law enforcement immediately. Her action is one of the most important elements of this entire story. She saw something. She said something. She protected her child and ensured that the person responsible was at least brought into the legal system, even if the outcome of that process was imperfect. Parents and guardians, please talk to your children about what appropriate relationships with teachers and adults in authority look like. Please create the kind of open, non-judgmental space at home where a young person feels safe enough to come to you if something feels wrong. And if you ever learn of something that raises a red flag, please do not hesitate to contact local law enforcement or the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-422-4453. Every child deserves to be safe. Every victim deserves justice. And every community deserves a legal system that delivers accountability without favoritism. If you believe every child deserves equal protection and equal justice, please like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. The work of telling these stories only continues because of your support. Thank you. Case 5. Brittany Zamora. Hundreds of messages and a broken trust. In the spring of 2018, parents of students at Las Brisas Academy in Goodyear, Arizona, received news that no parent ever wants to receive. The teacher they had trusted with their children, the young, married educator who stood at the front of the classroom every day, had been engaged in a criminal relationship with one of their children, and it had been going on for weeks before anyone outside the situation knew. The case of Brittany Zamora is one that is particularly sobering because of the sheer volume of evidence that investigators uncovered, evidence that painted a detailed and deeply troubling picture of how a trusted adult used modern technology, specifically a classroom communication app, to facilitate access to a child and to maintain a relationship that never should have existed. Brittany Zamora was 27 years old at the time of her arrest. She was a 6th-grade teacher at Las Brisas Academy, a public school in the West Valley area of suburban Phoenix. She had been working at the school for several years and was, by the accounts of many parents and colleagues, a teacher whose students liked and responded to. She was married. She was, in all the ways that neighbors and parents and community members could observe, exactly what she appeared to be, a young professional doing her job. The 13-year-old boy at the center of this case was a student in her class. Investigators would later determine that the relationship began in January of 2018, initiated through Remind, an application designed to allow teachers and students to communicate about assignments and school-related matters. The app was intended as a legitimate educational tool. Zamora used it for something else entirely. The communication between Zamora and the student escalated rapidly. According to the evidence reviewed by investigators and presented at trial, there were hundreds of messages exchanged between them, explicit, deeply inappropriate messages that no adult educator should ever send to a child in their care. Physical contact followed. Investigators determined that encounters occurred multiple times over the course of weeks. The case came to light through the vigilance of the boys' parents. They discovered the messages on their son's phone and brought them to the attention of investigators without delay. The Goodyear Police Department launched an immediate investigation. Officers reviewed the communications, interviewed the boy, and moved quickly to build a case. Brittany Zamora was arrested on March 21, 2018. She was taken into custody, and the case was filed with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. The evidence against her was extensive. There were hundreds of documented messages. There were witness accounts. There was physical evidence. And there were the accounts of the child himself, who had been placed in an impossible situation by an adult who held significant authority over him. In the months following her arrest, Zamora's case moved through the legal system. She entered a guilty plea. She did not go to trial, meaning that the young victim was spared the additional trauma of testifying in open court. A small but meaningful mercy in a case that had already taken so much from him. At her sentencing hearing in July of 2019, the court heard impact statements from members of the victim's family. The boy's parents spoke about the damage that had been done, not only the immediate harm, but the ongoing effects that the experience had had on their son's sense of trust, his relationships, his sense of safety in the world. A mother described watching her child change. A father described the anger and the grief of knowing that someone they had trusted had caused this harm. The judge sentenced Brittany Zamora to 20 years in prison. Under Arizona law, she is required to serve every day of that sentence. There is no possibility of early release. She will not be eligible for release until she is 47 years old. She is also required to register as a sex offender for life upon her release. The sentencing was covered extensively by local and national media. The 20-year mandatory sentence reflected the seriousness with which the Arizona legal system treated the crime, and it stood in notable contrast to the outcomes in some of the other cases documented in this very film. The case of Brittany Zamora raises important questions about the use of technology in educational settings. The Remind app, through which the initial contact was made, was designed with entirely benign intentions. It is used by thousands of teachers and students across the country every day without incident. But like any tool, it can be misused. And when it is misused by someone in a position of authority over a child, the consequences can be devastating. Many school districts across the United States updated and strengthened their policies around teacher-student digital communication in the wake of this case. Policies requiring that any digital communication between teachers and students take place on platforms that are monitored by the school, or that parents are copied on all communications, are now more common than they were before cases like this one brought the issue into sharp focus. For parents of school-age children, the lesson of this case is clear. Know what apps your child is using to communicate with their teachers. Know who has access to those platforms. Create an environment at home where your child feels comfortable telling you if any communication from an adult in their life makes them feel uncomfortable, confused, or pressured in any way. These conversations can be difficult to initiate, but they are among the most important conversations a parent can have. For educators watching this documentary, the lesson is equally clear. The trust that parents place in you when they send their children to your classroom is sacred. It is absolute. And any action that violates that trust, regardless of how it begins, regardless of the technology through which it is conducted, is a betrayal of everything the profession of teaching stands for. The young boy at the center of the Brittany Zamora case deserved to go to school and come home safely every day. He deserved a teacher, not a predator. He deserved a classroom that was a place of learning, not a place of harm. His family fought for accountability, and they received it. The 20-year sentence Brittany Zamora is serving is a direct reflection of the courage and the advocacy of a family who refused to let what happened to their son be minimized or explained away. If this case opened your eyes to a danger that not enough people are talking about, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Together, we can bring awareness to the cases that demand to be remembered. Thank you for watching. Case 6. Shelley Dufresne, the teacher who ran. There is a particular dimension of the cases we examine in this documentary that is easy to overlook in the midst of the legal details, the sentencing outcomes, and the courtroom drama. That dimension is the decision-making process. The moment when a person who knows, on some level, that what they are doing is wrong, makes the choice to keep doing it anyway. And the moment, even more revealing, when that person is confronted with the consequences of their actions and decides not to face them, but to run. Shelley Dufresne did not simply cross a line. She crossed it, recognized that it had been crossed, and then, when investigators began closing in, she made a decision that demonstrated with absolute clarity how far she was from taking any genuine responsibility for what she had done. Shelley Dufresne was an English teacher at Destrehan High School in Destrehan, Louisiana, a small community situated along the Mississippi River roughly 25 miles west of New Orleans. She was 32 years old in the fall of 2014 when the events that would end her career and lead to her criminal conviction began to unfold. She was a mother. She was, by most external accounts, a functioning member of her community who appeared committed to her professional responsibilities. Her victim was a 16-year-old male student at the same school where she taught. The details of how the relationship began have not been fully disclosed in public court documents. But what investigators determined was that Dufresne had engaged in repeated physical contact with the teenager over a period of time. The relationship was, by any legal definition, criminal. The student was a minor. Dufresne was his teacher. The authority she held over him was real, and the harm that flowed from the violation of that authority was equally real. When the relationship came to the attention of school administrators and law enforcement in the autumn of 2014, Dufresne did not wait to face the consequences. She fled. She took the student with her. The two of them were reported missing, and what followed was a period of active search by law enforcement before both individuals were located and the situation was brought under control. The decision to flee, to take a minor across any distance rather than submit to the investigation that was beginning, transformed an already serious situation into something with considerably graver implications. It demonstrated a willingness to prioritize self-preservation over the well-being of the very child whose well-being she had already betrayed. It demonstrated a refusal to acknowledge, even in the face of direct consequences, that what she had done was wrong. Shelley Dufresne was arrested and charged with carnal knowledge of a juvenile, a felony under Louisiana law. As the case progressed through the legal system, her defense team and prosecutors engaged in negotiations that ultimately resulted in a plea agreement. In April of 2015, Dufresne entered a guilty plea to a reduced charge of obscenity. The terms of the plea agreement were a source of considerable public discussion. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 90 days in an inpatient mental health treatment facility, and a financial penalty. She was not sentenced to incarceration beyond the treatment period. As with several other cases in this documentary, the relatively lenient outcome of the Dufresne case prompted immediate and pointed commentary from victims' advocates and legal analysts. The pattern of cases involving female teachers and male students receiving lighter sentences than male teachers in comparable situations was by 2015 already a well-documented and widely discussed issue. The Dufresne case added another data point to that conversation. There was a second teacher at Destrehan High School who was also investigated and charged in connection with related events during this same period. Rachel Respes, a 24-year-old teacher at the same school, was also charged with carnal knowledge of a juvenile in connection with the same student. The involvement of two teachers from the same school in connected circumstances with the same student added a dimension to this case that investigators and child protection professionals described as deeply alarming. Both women ultimately resolved their cases through plea agreements. Both received sentences that included probation rather than significant incarceration. The student at the center of both cases was, by any clinical and legal measure, a victim, a teenager who had been placed in relationships with adults who held authority over him and who should have protected him rather than harmed him. The school community at Destrehan High School was shaken by the revelations. Parents who had trusted the faculty with their children's education were left to process the fact that two members of that faculty had behaved in ways that were not only criminally wrong, but fundamentally incompatible with the responsibilities of their profession. The administration conducted a review of its policies. The district examined its oversight practices. These reviews and examinations, while necessary, could not undo the harm that had already been done. What the case of Shelley Dufresne reinforces, with uncomfortable clarity, is that the safety of young people in educational settings cannot be assumed. It must be actively maintained through strong institutional policies, regular oversight, open channels for reporting concerns, and a clear and consistent message from administrators that any violation of professional boundaries between staff and students will be treated with the full seriousness of the law. For school administrators and educators, the protocols that protect students from harm are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are safeguards. They are the difference between a student who comes home safe and a student who comes home changed. Please take them seriously. Please enforce them consistently. Please create environments where students know they can speak up and where what they say will be heard. If this story reinforced the importance of holding all educators to the same standards of accountability, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Your support helps this channel continue to shine a light on the stories that matter most. Thank you. Case 7. Holli Turner exploiting the trust of a student. In the landscape of cases we examine in this documentary, there are certain elements that appear again and again with a consistency that is both striking and sobering. The exploitation of digital communication. The erosion of professional boundaries that begins gradually before crossing into clearly criminal territory. The use of a teacher's inherent authority over a student to facilitate access. And the devastating impact on a young person who deserved nothing more than a safe and supportive educational environment. The case of Holli Turner, a Texas teacher whose actions in 2016 brought her before the criminal justice system, incorporates all of these elements. And while this case may not have generated the same volume of national headlines as some of the other cases documented here, it is no less significant in terms of what it represents and what it demands of us as a community. Holli Turner was a teacher working in Texas in the year 2016. She was an adult in a position of professional responsibility and institutional authority. The student at the center of her case was 17 years old. He was a teenager who, like every teenager in every classroom in America, had placed a degree of trust in the adults who were responsible for his education and his well-being. Investigators determined that Turner had engaged in sexual contact with the 17-year-old student and had exchanged explicit messages with him through digital platforms. The discovery of those messages was central to the investigation that ultimately led to her arrest. When Turner was confronted with the evidence gathered by investigators, she acknowledged her conduct. She admitted to the sexual contact. She admitted to the explicit messaging. These admissions became the foundation of the prosecution's case against her. Turner entered a guilty plea to the charge of an improper relationship between an educator and a student. In Texas, this charge is a second-degree felony, reflecting the serious view that the state takes of any sexual relationship between a teacher and a student, regardless of the age of the student. The law is clear and its application is consistent. A teacher who engages in a sexual relationship with a student is committing a felony, full stop, regardless of the student's age and regardless of any characterization of the relationship as consensual. She was sentenced to prison following her guilty plea. She was required to register as a sex offender, a consequence that would follow her for the rest of her life regardless of whatever other changes she might make. The Texas State Board for Educator Certification revoked her teaching certification, ensuring that she would not be permitted to return to a classroom in the state. The case of Holli Turner is important not only for its own facts, but for what it represents in the broader pattern of improper relationships between educators and students that law enforcement agencies across the United States have worked to address and prosecute over the past several decades. Texas, in particular, has been at the forefront of strengthening the legal framework around educator-student relationships. The state's improper relationship between educator and student statute is broadly written and strictly enforced, and it has been used in numerous prosecutions to send a clear and consistent message to anyone working in the state's educational system. The relationship between a teacher and a student is one of trust and authority, and any sexual dimension to that relationship is a crime. The student in the Turner case was a 17-year-old young man. In many states, 17 is the age of consent for relationships between adults. But Texas law, like the laws of many other states, specifically carves out an exception for educators. Even if a student is above the age of general consent, a teacher who engages in a sexual relationship with that student is still committing a felony. This is because the law recognizes something that psychology has long confirmed. The power differential between a teacher and a student creates a dynamic in which genuine consent, as the law and as ethics understand it, simply cannot exist. A student who is in a relationship with their teacher is not making a free and equal choice between two peers. They are responding to a situation shaped by power, authority, institutional hierarchy, and the complex psychological dynamics of adolescence. The law accounts for this reality, and cases like the one involving Holli Turner are precisely why those laws exist and why they must be consistently enforced. For the parents of teenagers, the protective instincts that make you watchful when your child is young do not become less important when they reach high school. The vulnerabilities of adolescence are real and significant. Open conversations about appropriate boundaries, about the nature of professional relationships, and about the legal reality that no teacher has the right to pursue any form of romantic or physical relationship with a student. These conversations are just as critical for parents of teenagers as they are for parents of younger children. And for the young people watching this documentary, you are never responsible for the behavior of an adult in authority over you. If someone who holds power over your education, your grades, your future opportunities, or your participation in school activities ever makes you feel uncomfortable, pressured, or confused, please talk to a parent, a different trusted adult, a school counselor, or contact a resource like the crisis text line by texting HOME to 741741. You deserve to be protected. You deserve to be safe. If this case reminded you why we need strong laws and strong enforcement to protect young people in our schools, please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Your engagement is what drives this work forward. Thank you for watching. Case 8. Emma Delaney Hancock, the substitute who crossed every line. In October of 2024, a courtroom in Lincoln County, Oklahoma delivered a verdict in a case that had drawn significant attention from both the local community and the national media. The defendant was a young woman who had been trusted, even if in a temporary capacity, with the education and safety of children in the Wellston Public School District. The verdict was guilty, and the case, which unfolded against the backdrop of a social media platform specifically designed around disappearing messages, raised questions about the intersection of modern technology, institutional oversight, and the protection of minors that are as urgent and relevant as any this documentary examines. Emma Delaney Hancock was a substitute teacher. She was not a full-time, credentialed member of the permanent faculty at Wellston Public Schools in Wellston, Oklahoma, a small community of fewer than 3,000 residents approximately 50 miles east of Oklahoma City. But her role as a substitute still placed her in a position of authority and access. Access to students, access to their trust, and access to the platforms through which they communicated. The victim in this case was a 15-year-old male student. He was a teenager navigating the ordinary challenges of adolescence, attending school in a small community where most people know each other, and where the assumption of basic institutional safety is part of the fabric of daily life. The investigation into Hancock's conduct revealed a pattern of behavior conducted primarily through Snapchat, the social media application known for its default feature of automatically deleting messages after they have been viewed. The use of Snapchat for this purpose was, investigators noted, almost certainly not accidental. The platform's design creates a sense of impermanence, of messages that disappear and leave no trace. This quality, which makes Snapchat attractive to teenagers for ordinary social communication, also makes it a platform that has been exploited in cases of this nature specifically because it appears to offer cover for conduct that would otherwise leave a visible trail. Investigators determined that Hancock had exchanged explicit images and messages with the 15-year-old student through this platform. They also determined that the contact had not remained digital. Physical encounters allegedly occurred, and in a detail that made this case particularly alarming to school administrators and community members alike. These encounters allegedly took place on school property. The idea that a minor could be harmed within the physical boundaries of the institution specifically designed to protect him, on the actual grounds of the school, represented a violation of safety that the community, found deeply difficult to process. School grounds are supposed to be among the safest places a child can be. The alleged use of that space as a location for criminal conduct against a student was a dimension of this case that elevated its gravity considerably. Hancock was investigated, charged, and brought to trial on 2 felony counts. The trial took place on October 30th, 2024, and after hearing the evidence, the jury returned a guilty verdict on both counts. The conviction represented a significant moment of accountability in a case that had shaken the Wellston community. On December 18, 2024, Emma Delaney Hancock was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The sentence was not suspended or converted to probation. It was a prison sentence, reflecting the court's assessment of the seriousness of the conduct and the need to deliver meaningful consequences for what had been done. Following her conviction, Hancock pursued an appeal through the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. That appeal was reviewed and ultimately rejected by the court in March of 2026. Upholding both the conviction and the sentence. As of the time of this documentary, Hancock is serving her sentence. The Wellston Public School District, like many small school districts across the country, relied on substitute teachers to fill staffing gaps throughout the school year. The vetting and oversight of substitute staff has historically been less rigorous than the processes applied to full-time faculty in many districts, a reality that advocates for student safety have pointed to as a systemic vulnerability. The Hancock case prompted renewed conversations in Oklahoma and across the country about the standards that should apply to anyone granted access to students in an educational setting, regardless of whether their role is permanent or temporary. For school administrators and school board members, the lesson of this case is clear. The protection of students cannot be conditional on whether a staff member has a permanent or a temporary status. Anyone who is placed in front of students, anyone who is given access to the school grounds and to the children on those grounds, must be held to the same standards of conduct, the same oversight protocols, and the same accountability as any permanent member of the faculty. For parents in communities served by small school districts, this case is a reminder to stay connected to what is happening in your children's schools, to know who is in the classrooms, to ask questions when something feels off, and to take seriously any concern your child brings to you about a teacher or adult at their school, whether that adult is a permanent staff member or a substitute. The 15-year-old boy at the center of this case was failed by an adult who exploited her temporary position of authority to cause him harm. He deserved better. He deserved a school where every adult, permanent or substitute, understood and honored the sacred responsibility that comes with access to children. The verdict and the sentence delivered in this case represent the justice system doing its job. The ongoing vigilance of parents, educators, and communities is what ensures that justice can be sought in cases like this one, because that vigilance is what ensures that the harm is discovered and reported in the first place. If this case underscored the importance of protecting every child in every classroom, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Every subscription helps this channel keep bringing you the documentary content that shines a light on the truth. Thank you. Case 9. Angelica Carrasquillo Fear in the 5th grade. Not every case of a teacher who causes harm to students involves physical conduct. Not every case fits neatly into the categories of assault or exploitation. Some of the most psychologically damaging things that can happen to a child happen through words, through the deliberate weaponization of fear, through the cold and calculated use of a position of authority to make a child feel unsafe, unwanted, and in danger. The case of Angelica Carrasquillo is disturbing in a different way from many of the other cases documented in this film. It is disturbing because of its setting, a 5th grade classroom, populated by children who were approximately 10 and 11 years old. And it is disturbing because of the specific nature of what Carrasquillo said and did, and what the law ultimately determined about those words and their consequences. St. Stanislaus School is a Catholic elementary school located in East Chicago, Indiana, a steel industry city on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, just southeast of Chicago. It is the kind of institution that families in its community have trusted for generations to provide a safe, values-based educational environment for their children. Parents who send their children to schools like St. Stanislaus are extending an act of profound trust. Trust in the institution, in its administration, and in the teachers who stand before their children every day. On October 12, 2022, that trust was shattered. On that day, Angelica Carrasquillo, a fifth-grade teacher at the school, told a student that she had a list of people she wanted to harm. The list, she said, included students. It included staff members. And she was explicit enough about the nature and the intent of this alleged list that the student who heard it was left genuinely frightened by what they had been told. Let us pause to consider the impact of that statement, delivered in a school, by a teacher, to a child who was approximately 10 years old. Children at that age have an understanding of violence that is shaped by everything they see and hear in the world around them. They live in a country where school safety is a constant and legitimate concern, where emergency drills and active threat protocols are a regular part of the educational experience. When an adult in a position of absolute authority over a child tells that child that she has a list of people she wants to harm, and that the child is on the list, the effect on that child's sense of safety, trust, and psychological well-being is not trivial. It is real, and it is lasting. The student who heard this statement told a trusted adult. That act of courage, a 10-year-old child speaking up about something deeply frightening, set in motion the events that would ultimately bring accountability to Angelica Carrasquillo. Law enforcement was contacted. An investigation was opened. The circumstances of what had occurred in that classroom were examined carefully. The account given by the student was taken seriously by investigators, as it should have been. The evidence gathered in the course of the investigation was sufficient to support criminal charges. Carrasquillo was charged with felony intimidation under Indiana law. The charge reflected the seriousness with which prosecutors viewed the conduct. An adult in a position of authority making statements to a child about wanting to cause harm to people, including that child, is not a matter of free expression or hyperbole. It is a crime. It creates fear. It damages the safety of the environment in which children are supposed to learn and grow. After the charges were filed, the case moved through the legal system. Angelica Carrasquillo entered a guilty plea to the felony intimidation charge. In August of 2023, she was sentenced. The sentence imposed by the court was 2.5 years of probation. As with several of the cases in this documentary, the outcome of the Carrasquillo case prompted discussion about whether the sentence adequately reflected the gravity of the harm caused. Some parents and child safety advocates argued that probation was insufficient for conduct that had caused genuine fear and psychological distress to children in the classroom. Others noted that the guilty plea demonstrated at least a degree of accountability, and that the probationary sentence was consistent with Indiana sentencing guidelines for this category of offense. What is beyond discussion is the impact on the children and families of St. Stanislaus School. The students who were in or connected to that fifth-grade classroom had to process the knowledge that their teacher, the adult who was supposed to make them feel safe and supported, had said words that made them afraid. Parents had to have conversations with their children about fear and safety and trust that no parent should ever have to have because of something a teacher said. The administration of the school faced the task of addressing the concerns of its school community, reassuring families, and ensuring that the protocols for identifying and addressing concerning behavior among staff were strengthened in the aftermath of what had occurred. The case of Angelica Carrasquillo also speaks to a broader issue that school administrators and mental health professionals have increasingly emphasized in recent years: the importance of monitoring the emotional and psychological well-being of teachers themselves, not as a punitive measure, but as a genuine support system. Teaching is a demanding, high-stress profession. Teachers carry enormous responsibility, often with inadequate support, inadequate resources, and inadequate recognition. When teachers are struggling, when the pressures of the profession and of personal life are combining in ways that are affecting a teacher's ability to function safely in the classroom, the system around them, their colleagues, their administrators, their union representatives, needs to be equipped to recognize those signs and to respond with both accountability and compassion. This is not to minimize or excuse what Carrasquillo said. It is wrong. Full stop. It was a crime, and the legal system appropriately treated it as such. But it is also a reminder that the health of a school community depends on the health of everyone in that community, students, staff, and teachers alike. For any student, or for any adult who knows a student who has been affected by threatening behavior or by conduct from a teacher or adult that has caused fear, The crisis text line is available 24 hours a day by texting HOME to 741-741. You are not alone, and you deserve to feel safe. The children of St. Stanislaus School deserved a classroom that felt like a safe place. Every child in every school in America deserves that same thing. And when it is taken from them by the very person whose job it is to provide it, the response of the community, the administration, and the legal system must be swift, serious, and centered entirely on the well-being of the children who were harmed. If this case made you think about what our children deserve from the adults entrusted with their care, please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Your voice and your support keep this channel going and these important stories being told. Thank you. Case 10. Pamela Smart, the teenager she turned into a weapon. We have arrived at the final case in this documentary. It is, in many ways, the most complex. It is the case that demands the most from us as viewers, because it asks us to hold multiple truths at the same time. Truths about manipulation and vulnerability, about the dynamics of power in relationships, about the gap between how people present themselves and who they actually are, and about the devastating consequences that unfold when an adult weaponizes the feelings of a teenager to accomplish something no honest person could ever justify. The name Pamela Smart is one that became known to the entire country in the spring of 1991. The trial that followed the events of May 1st, 1990 was, at the time, one of the first criminal trials in American history to be broadcast live on television. It drew millions of viewers. It inspired multiple books, at least 2 major films, and a body of academic scholarship examining everything from media coverage of female criminality to the psychology of adolescent vulnerability to the ethics of televised trials. But beneath all of that media and all of that cultural weight, there is a story. A real story about real people. A story about a young man who should have been protected, a husband who did not deserve what happened to him, and a woman who made choices so calculated and so catastrophic that she has spent the last 3 decades, and will likely spend the rest of her life, behind bars. Let us begin where the story begins. Pamela Warmus was born in October of 1966 in Miami, Florida. She was raised in an upper-middle-class family and described herself, and was described by those who knew her, as ambitious, driven, and deeply invested in her own image. She attended Florida State University, studied communications, and developed what she clearly saw as a media-facing identity. She was someone who understood how to present herself, how to craft a narrative, and how to make people see what she wanted them to see. She married Greg Smart in the spring of 1989. He was a young insurance salesman. By all accounts, he was a kind and genuine person who loved his wife and was attempting to build a life with her. They settled in Derry, New Hampshire, a community in the southeastern part of the state. Pamela had taken a position as the director of media services at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire, a school where she would work with students on the school's television production and media programming. It was in this capacity, not as a classroom teacher but as a staff member with regular access to students, that Pamela Smart met a 15-year-old boy named William Billy Flynn. He was a student at the school. He was a teenager with a teenager's capacity for intense feeling, for infatuation, for the kind of overwhelming emotional experience that adolescence generates and that adults are supposed to understand and protect against, not exploit. What developed between Pamela Smart and Billy Flynn was, according to the evidence presented at trial and the accounts of those directly involved, a deliberately constructed emotional and physical relationship. Smart, who was 22 years old at the time, initiated and cultivated the relationship with Flynn, who was, again, 15. She told him she loved him. She made him feel special, chosen, significant. She also told him, according to his account and the accounts of others who were part of the social group around them, that the relationship had a problem. The problem was her husband. And she told Billy Flynn that if things were going to work between them, Greg Smart was going to have to go. The conversations about what to do about Greg Smart were not vague or abstract. According to the evidence presented at trial, they were specific and deliberate. Smart allegedly told Flynn that she would harm herself, that she would end her own life, if he did not take action. She allegedly offered him jewelry, possessions from the marital home, as incentives. She created a situation in which a 15-year-old boy, who was in the grip of the most intense emotional experience of his young life, who genuinely believed he was in love, and who had been told by the adult he trusted most that his inaction would cause her to take her own life, felt that he had no choice but to do what she was asking. On the night of May 1st, 1990, Billy Flynn and 3 of his friends entered the Smart home in Derry while Greg was there alone. What followed was a confrontation that ended with Greg Smart losing his life at the age of 24, shot once in the head. He was found by Pamela Smart when she returned home that evening. She called the police. She performed the role of the grieving widow with what investigators later noted was a disturbing degree of fluency. The investigation that followed was thorough and ultimately decisive. Investigators focused on the young men involved and, through their accounts and cooperation, built a picture of what had actually happened. Billy Flynn cooperated with prosecutors. Cecilia Pierce, a student who had been part of the social circle and who had been recruited by investigators to wear a wire during a conversation with Smart, provided some of the most damning evidence in the case. Pamela Smart's own words, captured on that recording, were a central element of the prosecution's case. She was heard expressing concern not about Greg, not about the gravity of what had happened, but about the possibility of getting caught. She was heard attempting to manage the narrative, to coach those around her on what to say and what not to say. The recordings left very little room for the defense to construct a credible alternative explanation. Pamela Smart was arrested in August of 1990. The trial began in March of 1991 and was broadcast live, a first in New Hampshire legal history. The country watched as the prosecution laid out its case, and as Smart's defense team attempted to counter it. The jury deliberated for approximately 13 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, being an accomplice to first-degree murder, and witness tampering. She was sentenced in May of 1991 to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was 24 years old. For 3 decades, Pamela Smart has maintained her innocence. She has given interviews from behind bars at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, where she has been incarcerated since the 90s. She has filed appeals. She has worked within the prison system and has reportedly participated in educational programs. She has, by the accounts of those who have observed her over the years, continued to project the same carefully managed self-presentation that characterized her behavior before and during the trial. Every appeal has been denied. Every claim of innocence has been reviewed against the weight of the evidence, the testimony, the recordings, the physical evidence, the accounts of Billy Flynn and the other young men who were present, and every review has reached the same conclusion. The conviction stands. Billy Flynn pleaded guilty to charges in connection with Greg Smart's death. He was sentenced to prison and was eventually released on parole in 2015, after serving more than 2 decades. His release prompted renewed public discussion about the case and about the role he played. A teenager who was manipulated by an adult into participating in an act of violence he might never have approached on his own. The case of Pamela Smart is, at its most essential level, a story about the weaponization of a young person's trust and emotional vulnerability. Billy Flynn was not an adult making a free and fully informed choice. He was a 15-year-old boy who had been told by the most significant adult in his emotional universe that he was loved, that he was special, and that the only way to preserve that love was to act. The dynamics of adolescent psychology, the particular vulnerability of a teenager in the grip of first love, and the enormous power differential between a 22-year-old staff member and a 15-year-old student. All of these factors converged in a way that a psychologically sophisticated adult could exploit and did exploit. Greg Smart deserved to live. He deserved to grow old. He deserved the future that was taken from him on the night of May 1st, 1990, in a house he thought was a home. He was 24 years old. He had never harmed anyone. He was simply in the way. And the person who had made him in the way was someone he had chosen to build his life with. The broader lessons of this case for educators, school administrators, and policymakers are significant. The relationship between Pamela Smart and Billy Flynn began in a school setting. It was facilitated by her role as a staff member with regular access to students. The trust that parents and the community placed in the school was exploited as a vehicle for access to a vulnerable young person. Schools must have clear and strictly enforced policies governing not only the conduct of classroom teachers, but the conduct of all staff members, coaches, media coordinators, counselors, administrative staff, who have regular contact with students. The harm that can flow from the misuse of that access is not limited to the student directly involved. As this case demonstrates with devastating clarity, the consequences can extend far beyond the school grounds and can reach people who never set foot in the building at all. For families who want to speak with a professional about concerns related to the psychological well-being of a young person in their life, the SAMHSA National Helpline is available at 1-800-662-4357, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, free of charge and confidential. You are not alone, and help is always available. Greg Smart's family, including his parents, who spent decades advocating tirelessly for the preservation of his sentence and the integrity of the verdict, deserve recognition for their enduring commitment to accountability. They were asked to carry an enormous weight, to lose a son to violence, and then to watch as the woman they held responsible continued to proclaim her innocence on a public stage. They carried that weight with dignity, and they continued to make their voices heard in every parole and appeal proceeding. Pamela Smart remains incarcerated. Greg Smart remains gone. And the case of the young man who was turned into a weapon against a husband who had done nothing wrong remains one of the most profound and troubling examples in the entire documented history of abuse of authority by those in positions of trust over young people. Justice was served in this case. It was slow, and it was public, and it was watched by the entire country. But it was served. And for the families of victims in similar situations who are still waiting, still hoping, and still fighting, that outcome is a reminder that the truth, even when it takes time, has a way of finding the light. If this final case moved you, if this documentary as a whole has meant something to you, if these 10 stories have reminded you why it matters that we remember, that we pay attention, and that we refuse to let the pursuit of justice become a matter of convenience, then please take a moment right now to show Cold Case Time your support. Like this video. Leave a comment below telling us which case you found most impactful, or share your thoughts on why stories like these deserve to be told. And most importantly, subscribe to the Cold Case Time channel so you are notified every time a new documentary drops. Every single click, every comment, every subscription is a vote for the kind of content that respects victims, pursues the truth, and treats these stories with the gravity and the dignity they deserve. This channel exists because of you. This documentary exists because of you. And the next one will too. Thank you for watching Cold Case Time. Stay curious, stay aware, and never stop asking the questions that matter.